"Ma'am, you need to get off this plane. Now." The words didn't echo. They cut, sharp and public, slicing straight through the quiet comfort of first class at 32,000 feet as every head turned at once, eyes locking onto a single figure seated in 2A. A black woman in a charcoal hoodie and dark jeans, her posture steady, her gaze forward, unmoved as if the command had been issued to someone else entirely, and for a moment, no one breathed because the tension didn't rise gradually. It snapped into place like a switch flipped too fast to follow. And the man standing over her, a uniformed security officer with a clipped tone and rehearsed authority, shifted his stance like he expected compliance, like he had seen this before, like this was routine. But Naomi Carter didn't move, not when the flight attendant behind him crossed her arms and whispered just loud enough for the row behind to hear. "She doesn't belong here." Not when a man across the aisle let out a low chuckle and muttered something about delays and people trying to sit where they didn't pay to be. Not even when a woman 2 rows back raised her phone halfway, unsure if what she was seeing was real or just another moment people pretend not to notice, because Naomi had seen this before too. Not this exact cabin, not this exact airline, but the look, the assumption, the quiet calculation that happened in less than a second when someone decided who you were allowed to be based on how you appeared. And she let the silence stretch, not defensive, not reactive, just present, grounded, like she was measuring the room instead of shrinking inside it. While the officer cleared his throat and repeated himself louder this time. "Ma'am, you're going to need to come with me." And still she didn't move, not because she didn't hear him, but because she understood something no one else in that cabin did yet. That moments like this weren't about volume or speed. They were about timing, and timing, when controlled, could turn a room upside down without a single raised voice. And somewhere behind her, a younger flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Naomi and the tablet in her hand like something didn't add up, like a detail was out of place. But she said nothing, not yet, because hierarchy was louder than doubt. In spaces like this, and the cabin air, once cool and indifferent, now felt charged, thick with expectation, as if everyone sensed something was about to happen but couldn't name it. And Naomi finally blinked once, slow and deliberate. Her voice when it came low and even, not defensive, not emotional, just precise. "On what basis?" she asked, and it wasn't a protest. It was a question placed like a weight in the center of the aisle, forcing everyone within earshot to confront it whether they wanted to or not. And the officer hesitated. Not long, not enough for most to notice, but enough. And in that fraction of a second, the balance of the moment shifted, just slightly, just enough to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the story unfolding in this cabin wasn't going to follow the script they thought it would. Naomi Carter did not raise her voice, did not reach for her bag, did not even shift in her seat as the seconds stretched into something heavier than time, something that pressed against every person watching, because the stillness coming from her did not feel like hesitation, it felt deliberate. Like she had chosen this exact moment long before anyone else realized they were part of it. And the officer standing in the aisle felt it too, even if he could not explain it, his posture tightening, just slightly as he adjusted his grip on the situation that no longer felt as simple as removing a passenger, while the senior flight attendant behind him stepped forward with a practiced smile that did not reach her eyes and said, "Ma'am, we have policies for a reason, and right now you are not complying." Her tone polished, but edged with something colder underneath. Something that had already decided the outcome before the conversation even began, and Naomi turned her head just enough to meet her gaze, not confrontational, not submissive, just present. And in that look there was a quiet recognition, as if she had seen this exact performance before, in different rooms, with different uniforms, but always the same script, always the same assumption hiding behind the word policy. And across the aisle the man who had laughed earlier leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms like he had settled in to watch something unfold, whispering to the woman beside him. They should have caught this at the gate. As if Naomi were a mistake that had slipped through a system designed to filter people like her out. And a few rows behind them a phone lifted higher now, no longer hesitant, the red recording light reflecting faintly off the cabin wall, as someone quietly said, "This does not look right." But no one directly intervened yet, because that is how moments like this worked. They built slowly, layer by layer. until silence itself became part of the problem, and near the galley the younger attendant, Emily Ross, looked down again at her handheld device, her brow tightening as she scrolled, then looked up at Naomi, then back at the screen, like she was trying to reconcile two versions of reality that refused to match, and she took a small step forward before stopping herself, the weight of rank and expectation holding her in place, while Naomi finally moved, not to stand, not to comply, but to rest her hands calmly on the armrests as she spoke again, her voice steady, measured, impossible to ignore. "You keep saying policy," she said, "but you have not told me which one." And the question landed differently this time, not as a challenge, but as a spotlight, exposing the gap between authority and certainty. And for a brief moment the attendant's expression flickered, just enough to reveal doubt before it was quickly replaced with control. "We do not need to explain every procedure," she replied, a little sharper now, a little less composed. And that was when Emily could not hold it in anymore, her voice cutting in from behind, hesitant but clear. "Her boarding pass scanned green at the gate," she said, and the words did not shout, they did not demand attention, but they shifted the air in the cabin all the same, because now there was a crack in the narrative, a small but undeniable fracture that made people look again, listen closer, question just enough to unsettle the certainty that had filled the aisle seconds earlier. And Naomi did not react to the defense, did not acknowledge it outwardly, but the slightest exhale escaped her, almost imperceptible, as if something had just aligned exactly the way she expected it would. And in that moment the scene was no longer about removing a passenger. It was about something deeper, something none of them fully understood yet, but all of them were now part of whether they wanted to be or not. The words hung in the air longer than they should have, that quiet correction from someone who was not supposed to speak, and suddenly the balance inside the cabin shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that people started to look at each other instead of just at Naomi Carter, because now there was uncertainty where certainty had been, and uncertainty made people uncomfortable, especially those who had already decided what was true. And the senior flight attendant turned sharply toward Emily Ross, her expression tightening as she said, "That is not relevant right now." But the way she said it carried something else beneath it, something closer to urgency than authority, and Emily did not step back this time, her voice still careful but steadier now. "It is relevant if we are saying she does not belong here." And a few passengers nodded without realizing they were doing it, small movements that signaled something was changing in the room, while the man across the aisle who had been so certain moments ago shifted in his seat, his confidence no longer as loud as before, and Naomi remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression unreadable, but her presence now felt larger, not because she had done anything different, but because the room itself had begun to adjust around her. And that is when the officer tried to regain control, stepping forward again with a firmer tone. "Ma'am, this is your final request," he said, emphasizing each word like structure could replace certainty. But Naomi turned her head slightly toward him and asked one simple question. "Who made the decision?" And it landed heavier than anything else she had said, because it did not resist the command. It traced it back. It forced accountability into a moment that had been operating on assumption, and for a brief second, no one answered. Not the officer, not the attendant, not anyone. And that silence stretched just long enough to expose the fact that there was no clear answer, only a chain of reactions built on perception, and behind them a phone was now fully raised, recording steadily as a woman whispered, "They do not even know why." And that whisper traveled faster than any announcement, because it carried truth without needing volume, and Emily took another step forward, now fully committed. "I can pull the scan log," she said, holding up her device slightly, and the senior attendant's voice snapped back, sharper now. "That will not be necessary." But the edge in her tone betrayed something she could not fully control anymore, because the narrative was slipping, and once that happened, it was hard to pull it back, and Naomi finally shifted, just a fraction, enough to sit a little straighter, her hands still resting calmly, her voice steady as she spoke. "Again, you are asking me to leave a seat I paid for, based on a decision no one here can explain." And she did not raise her voice, she did not need to, because by now every person within earshot was listening, fully, completely, as if the entire cabin had become a single space, a single moment, a single question waiting for an answer that was not coming. And in that growing silence, something else began to emerge. Something quieter, but far more powerful than authority, the beginning of doubt. And Naomi Carter did not fight the system in front of her. She let it reveal itself, piece by piece, until everyone could see exactly what it was. The shift did not come from a shout or a command, but from a screen, small and glowing in the hands of a passenger 3 rows back, where a video had already begun to circulate beyond the cabin itself, because what happened inside a sealed aircraft no longer stayed contained at 32,000 feet, and the woman holding the phone tilted it slightly, whispering under her breath, "This is already online." As the numbers ticked upward faster than anyone in that aisle could track, and suddenly, the moment was no longer private. It was visible, expanding, judged not just by those seated in first class, but by thousands of unseen eyes. And that realization moved through the crew like a current, subtle but undeniable, changing posture, tone, even breathing, because now every word carried weight beyond the cabin. And the senior flight attendant noticed it first, her gaze flicking briefly toward the raised phones before snapping back to Naomi Carter, trying to regain control of a narrative that was no longer hers alone. "Everyone needs to remain seated," she said, her voice louder now, directed at the room rather than the individual, but the authority in. It felt thinner, stretched across too many watching eyes, and Naomi did not look at the phones, did not acknowledge the growing digital audience, because her focus remained exactly where it had been from the start, on the system unfolding in front of her, predictable, layered, revealing itself step by step. And near the aisle, Emily Ross lifted her device again, this time not hesitating, her fingers moving quickly as she accessed the scan log she had mentioned, her voice steady despite the tension pressing in around her. "Her ticket cleared at the gate at 5:42 p.m., she said, reading directly from the screen, and the precision of the time made it harder to dismiss, harder to blur into assumption, and a ripple moved through the passengers, quiet but real, as people exchanged looks that said something was wrong here, something that could not be explained away with a vague reference to policy. And the officer shifted again, his stance less certain now as he glanced toward the attendant as if waiting for direction that was no longer coming clearly. And Naomi finally turned her head slightly toward Emily, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the voice that had stepped forward, her expression unchanged but her presence sharpening. And then she spoke again, her tone calm, but carrying further than before. "Thank you," she said, simple, direct, and that acknowledgement did something unexpected. It anchored the moment. It turned Emily's statement from a risk into a fact. And facts, once spoken, had a way of refusing to disappear, and the man across the aisle uncrossed his arms, leaning forward now instead of back, his earlier confidence replaced with curiosity, even discomfort, while another passenger lifted her phone higher, her voice no longer a whisper. "This is not right," she said, and the words landed differently now because they were no longer isolated. They were part of a growing chorus, small but building, and the senior attendant felt it slipping. The control, the certainty, the clean narrative that had started this entire moment. And she tried once more, her tone tightening. "We are handling this internally." But even as she said it, it sounded less like assurance and more like defense, because the room had changed, the balance had shifted, and Naomi Carter remained at the center of it all, unmoved, unshaken, letting the system speak louder than she ever needed. 2. The cabin no longer felt like a place in transit, but like a moment suspended, stretched thin between what had already happened and what was about to unfold. And in that fragile space, the smallest actions carried the greatest weight, because now every eye was watching not just Naomi Carter but the system around her, waiting to see what it would do next. And that was when the officer made his move again, not aggressive, not forceful, but final in tone as he reached slightly forward and said, "Ma'am, we cannot delay this flight any longer." And though his hand did not touch her, the implication was clear. The boundary had been crossed from suggestion to enforcement, and the air tightened instantly, conversation stopping mid-breath as the moment sharpened into something irreversible. And Naomi felt it, not as fear but as recognition, because she had stood in moments like this before, years ago, in spaces that were smaller, quieter, less visible but just as defining, and for a split second the cabin dissolved into memory, into a different gate, a different year, when she was 22 years old standing at a boarding line in Chicago, holding a valid ticket while a gate agent scanned it twice and frowned, as if the system itself had made a mistake. "This cannot be right," the woman had said back then, not loudly, not cruelly, just certain in a way that did not require proof. And Naomi remembered the way people behind her had shifted, impatient, assuming delay without asking why. Remembered how she had stepped aside that day, not because she was wrong but because she had not yet learned that silence could be used as strategy instead of surrender. And now, years later, standing in a different kind of spotlight, she returned fully to the present, her gaze steady as the officer waited, as the attendant watched, as the passengers recorded, and she slowly rose from her seat, not rushed, not pushed, but on her own terms, her movements controlled, deliberate, and the entire cabin seemed to lean forward with her, because the question was no longer whether she would stand, it was what would happen next. And as she reached for her phone, her voice came low and precise, not directed at the crew but into the device itself. "Log this incident," she said, each word measured, timestamp. "Everything from first contact." And on the other end a voice responded immediately, clear and composed. "Confirmed, Naomi." Recording initiated, and the name, spoken aloud for the first time in that cabin, did not land loudly but it lingered, unfamiliar yet significant, as if it carried more meaning than anyone there could immediately place. And the officer hesitated again, just for a fraction, his certainty slipping further as the structure of the moment began to shift beyond his control. And Naomi lifted her eyes back to him, her voice unchanged. "You are making a decision without verification," she said, and there was no anger in it, only clarity, and that clarity cut deeper than any raised tone could have, because now the situation was no longer about compliance, it was about consequence. And behind her Emily stood still, her device held close, her expression no longer uncertain but resolved, while the passengers remained fixed in place, phones raised, silence no longer passive, but expectant, waiting, because something had crossed a line that could not be undone. And Naomi Carter stood in the aisle, calm, grounded, fully present, not resisting the moment but stepping into it, exactly as she intended. The moment Naomi Carter spoke her name into the call, something invisible shifted in the cabin, not loud, not obvious, but precise, like a gear locking into place deep within a system no one else could see. And while the passengers were still focused on what had already happened, Naomi had already moved forward into what would happen next, her mind several steps ahead, her posture steady as she listened for a fraction of a second before speaking again, her voice low, controlled, unmistakably intentional. "Initiate full aviation exposure review," she said, each word clean, unhurried. "Flag Horizon Air Portfolio, priority level 1. And on the other end there was no confusion, no hesitation, only immediate execution. "Confirmed, pulling live positions now." The voice replied, sharp and efficient, and though most of the cabin could not hear the response clearly, they felt it, the shift from uncertainty to something structured, something real. And Naomi ended the call without flourish, lowering the phone slowly as her eyes returned to the officer, not with defiance, not with emotion, but with clarity. And that clarity unsettled him more than resistance ever could have, because it suggested that whatever was happening was no longer contained within the narrow space of the aisle. And behind him the senior attendant tried once more to reassert control, her tone now edged with urgency. "We are not discussing this further. You need to step off the aircraft." But the words landed differently this time, thinner, less certain, because the room had already begun to question her authority. And Naomi tilted her head just slightly, her voice calm but cutting through the tension with surgical precision. "You are enforcing a decision you did not verify," she said, "and now it is being documented in real time." And that phrase, documented, carried weight far beyond the cabin, because it implied permanence, consequence, accountability, and a few passengers exchanged glances, the realization settling in that this was no longer just an incident. It was a record, something that would exist long after the plane landed. And Emily stood still near the galley, her device now lowered but her presence unwavering, watching closely as if she understood that the moment had crossed into something irreversible, and the officer shifted his stance again, his confidence eroding in subtle ways, his eyes flicking briefly toward the attendant, then back to Naomi, searching for footing that was no longer there, and across the aisle the man who had spoken earlier leaned forward again, but this time he said nothing, his expression tightened, uncertain, as if he was recalculating everything he thought he understood about the situation, and Naomi remained centered in it all, not raising her voice, not stepping back, simply standing in the truth of what was unfolding. And then her phone vibrated once, a small sound that seemed louder than it should have in the silence, and she glanced down briefly, reading a message that confirmed what she already expected, the system responding, the process moving, the consequences beginning to take shape beyond the reach of anyone in that cabin. And when she looked back up, her expression had not changed, but something else had, something deeper, a quiet certainty that the moment had passed the point where anyone there could control its outcome, and the cabin, once filled with assumption and authority, now held something entirely different, anticipation, because everyone could feel it, even if they could not yet name it, that whatever came next was not going to belong to the people who started this. It was going to belong to Naomi Carter. The shift did not announce itself with a sound, but with a signal, subtle and immediate. As the cockpit door opened and the captain stepped into the aisle, his expression controlled but tight around the edges, the kind of look that only appeared when something outside the normal chain of command had interrupted the flow, and every eye followed him as he moved forward, not toward Naomi Carter at first, but toward the senior attendant, his voice low but urgent as he said, "I need a word," and, though he tried to keep it contained, the tension in his tone carried further than he intended, because this was no longer routine, and the attendant leaned in, listening, her confidence unraveling in real time as whatever she heard replaced certainty with something closer to concern, and Naomi watched without moving, her gaze steady, because this was the moment where systems began to collide, where internal assumptions met external reality, and one of them would not survive the contact, and the captain straightened slightly, turning now toward Naomi, his posture shifting from authority to something more measured, more cautious. "Ma'am," he began, and even that word landed differently now, stripped of the sharpness it had carried earlier. "Can you confirm your full name?" And the question rippled through the cabin like a quiet shock, because it meant something had changed. Something had reached beyond the aisle and into the systems that governed everything else, and Naomi did not hesitate, her voice calm, precise. "Naomi Carter," she said, and for a fraction of a second nothing happened, and then everything did, because the name did not exist in isolation. It connected, it triggered recognition somewhere beyond the cabin, and the captain's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, as if the confirmation aligned with something he had just been told, something he had not expected to hear. And behind him, the attendant stepped back half a step, her earlier certainty dissolving into silence, while the officer remained still, caught between instructions that no longer matched the situation in front of him. And Naomi held his gaze for a moment before speaking again, her voice even, controlled, but now carrying a weight that had not been visible before. "You removed a verified passenger," she said, "without confirmation, without cause, and in full view of recorded evidence." And she let the words settle. Not rushed, not emphasized, just stated, because truth did not need volume, and the captain exhaled slowly, his composure tightening as he processed the implications, and then Naomi added one more line, the one that shifted everything completely. "You also removed a primary investor in your airline." And this time the silence that followed was absolute, not uncertain, not questioning, but stunned, because the meaning of that statement did not require explanation. It landed fully formed, undeniable, and across the cabin. Phones remained raised, but no one spoke, no one moved, as if the entire space had paused to absorb what had just been said, and the captain's posture changed again, not dramatically but unmistakably, the authority he carried now redirecting itself, recalibrating in real time as he looked at Naomi not as a passenger, not as a disruption, but as something entirely different, something that had always been there but had only just been recognized. And Naomi Carter stood in the aisle, exactly where They had placed her, but no longer in the position they thought she held. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured slowly, like something collapsing from the inside out. Because the moment Naomi Carter spoke those words, the structure that had held the situation together could no longer support itself, and the captain felt it first, his posture tightening as his eyes shifted briefly toward the tablet in his hand, then back to Naomi, then to the senior attendant, who now stood completely still, her earlier confidence replaced by something closer to realization, and it spread from there, through the officer who stepped back half a pace without being told, through the passengers who no longer whispered but watched openly, and through Emily Ross who stood near the galley, her expression no longer uncertain but resolved, as if she had just witnessed the exact point where truth overtook assumption, and Naomi did not move, did not step forward, did not press the advantage, because she did not need to. The system was already responding, and then it happened, not with a shout but with a sound, a quiet notification tone from the captain's device, sharp in the stillness, and he looked down, his eyes scanning quickly, once, then again, as if confirming something he could not ignore, and whatever he saw changed everything, because his shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in recalibration, and he turned fully toward Naomi now, his voice measured, controlled, but unmistakably different. "Miss Carter," he said, using her name with precision. "We need to correct this immediately." And the word correct carried weight, because it acknowledged error without needing to explain it. And behind him the senior attendant took a step back, then another, her authority dissolving in real time as the consequences of her earlier decisions caught up with her, and Naomi finally moved, not toward the exit, not toward the cockpit, but just enough to shift her stance, grounding herself as she spoke, her voice calm, steady, final. "The moment you chose assumption over verification," she said, "this stopped being an incident and became a liability." And the word landed harder than anything before it, because it spoke in the language of systems, of consequences that extended far beyond the cabin, and the captain nodded once, slow, understanding exactly what that meant, and then his device sounded. Again, another notification, followed by another, and this time he did not need to read them aloud, because the reaction on his face was enough, the realization settling in that whatever had been set in motion was not contained, it was expanding, reaching into departments, into systems, into decisions that would ripple outward long after this flight. And across the aisle a passenger whispered, "Something just happened." And she was right, because the shift was no longer subtle, it was visible, tangible, as if the entire structure of authority had inverted itself in the span of seconds, and Naomi Carter stood at the center of it, not elevated, not dramatic, just exact, her presence steady as the consequences unfolded around her, and the captain straightened once more, his voice now directed not at Naomi but at the crew. "Stand down," he said, firm, clear, leaving no room for interpretation. And the words marked the end of one version of the story and the beginning of another, one, where control had already moved beyond the hands that tried to hold it, and Naomi did not need to say anything else, because everything that needed to happen was already in motion. No one spoke after that command, not because they were told to be silent, but because silence was the only thing left that made sense. And in that silence Naomi Carter adjusted her sleeve slightly, a small movement that somehow carried more control than anything that had happened before, and the cabin, once tense with confrontation, now felt something entirely different, not relief, not even resolution, but recognition, because what had unfolded was no longer just about one moment or one decision. It was about everything that decision revealed, and the captain stepped aside, not dramatically, not ceremoniously, just enough to clear the space in front of her, an unspoken acknowledgement that the center of authority had shifted, and Naomi did not rush, did not reclaim her seat immediately. She simply looked around the cabin once, her gaze steady, meeting no one directly, yet reaching everyone all at once. And in that glance there was no anger, no triumph, only clarity, the kind that does not need validation because it stands on its own. And the passengers who had been recording slowly lowered their phones, not because the moment had ended, but because it had transformed into something they did not want to interrupt, something that demanded to be understood rather than captured. And Emily Ross remained still near the galley, her shoulders squared now, no longer hesitant, as if she had stepped into a version of herself she had not expected to find that day. While the senior attendant stood further back, her presence diminished not by force but by consequence, her earlier words echoing in a space that no longer supported them. And Naomi finally spoke, not loudly, not for attention, but with a calm precision that carried through the entire cabin. "This was never about a seat," she said, her voice even, grounded. "It was about what you assumed before you verified." And the words settled into the room, not as accusation but as truth, and no one moved to challenge it, because there was nothing left to argue. And she continued, "Just one more line, measured, final. You did not remove a problem, you exposed one." And that was it. No explanation, no elaboration, just a statement that reframed everything that had happened into something larger than the moment itself. And the captain nodded once, quietly, not as agreement but as acknowledgement, as understanding, and Naomi turned then, not toward the back of the plane, not toward the exit, but toward her seat, reclaiming it without ceremony, without hesitation, as if it had never truly been taken from her. And when she sat down, the cabin did not return to what it had been before, because it could not. Something had shifted too deeply for that, something that would follow each person there long after the flight landed. And Naomi Carter rested her hands calmly once more, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as the system around her recalibrated in silence. And in that quiet, one truth remained, clear and undeniable. She had not raised her voice. She had raised the standard.